Andrew and I crossed paths more than a decade ago. We were both looking for ways to get society to break out of the customary way of thinking that was driving us to ruin. It was inevitable that we would meet. Many CACOR members have voiced the Einstein quote that we cannot solve our problems with the same sort of thinking that caused the problems. Andrew's here to show us ways to shift our way of thinking so perhaps we can develop sustainable ways to live. Andrew?
Thanks very much, Mike. So CACOR will probably be my most challenging audience. I think each and every one of you is better educated, better read, better connected, better practiced, and probably better informed than I. So my challenge today, from my slightly different mental model of the world, is to give you a unique framework in which to reflect on all of the pieces of the puzzle that you already have, in the hope that it may give you powerful new insights. I'm not going to be revealing a lot of new information. You already know most of this stuff. Indeed, I prepared this talk by reviewing all of the 150 CACOR presentations online. So I stand on the shoulders of giants, drawing on that extensive material and the discussions that were inspired afterwards. So we're going to look at things from 30,000 feet today. Part one will look at the highly generalized framework that I used. I believe it's unique in the world of ecological economics, and it's useful for understanding why we face the challenges that we do. And then part two will apply that framework to what we already know from past CACOR talks. And from there, I'll propose some bold solution strategies, ideas which will be vaguely familiar, but with a surprising twist to their objectives. There's a lot, so let's get started. So the CACOR talks I reviewed generally fall into one of four categories. The most common is what I call information/history, sharing of what is known or has already happened. The second most popular consists of pitches for expert solutions, a belief that the answers to the problems are knowable, we just have to do them. And the third describes the general problems themselves, and they underscore the complexity of what we face. The fourth and fewest talks are those that examined different paradigms or reviewing or questioning the knowledge we take for granted and looking at it in a different light. They're one layer above the world of history and problems and solutions. So this will be a talk like that. My practical approach to the mechanics of these challenges is nicely summarized in these recent talks by Bill Rees and David Corton on the CACOR website video list. If you watch nothing else from that list, watch these. So Bill Rees makes a very convincing and well-supported argument for how we are kidding ourselves that any action we now talk about will ever actually happen to the degree that we need. And I think he's right. And if you want to know why, watch his talk for yourself. I'll expand on this in due course. David Corton describes what has to be done instead. We're mostly familiar with those proposals, but perhaps not to the degree that he believes is required. My writing describes how we got to the point where it has to be done and why nothing has been done, and therefore proposes a filter for validating what has to be done differently and how it will happen. So I call humanity's challenge a value crisis. Every global mega risk, starting with the 10 described by Julian Cribb, right through to the downside of cruise tourism, right through to that, you name it. It's all, in my belief, distilled down to a single faulty value. And that is the idea that there is anything for which more is always worth more. Everything comes down to that. This is the essence of values which are measured by number. Now, we might be counting cows or slaves or grams of gold or dollars in a bank account or votes or likes or followers or page hits, whatever. The point is that the basis of such values, that more is always worth more, does not exist in any natural environment. I mean, some things might look like they are worth more: food, warmth, sex, but these are all temporary. They all have a level of sufficiency. more water is not always worth more, unless you're Nestle, deciding that you own it and then selling it. So Lalith on our values committee recently talked about what he called the why tree. Let's run a few of our well-known global death traps through that process. So why are we going through a sixth mass extinction, which is moving faster than any of the previous five? Well, there's several reasons, including loss of habitat, overharvesting of resources, ignoring interconnectedness and species interreliance. So why do we have a loss of habitable environment? Well, physical habitat removal, poisoning of environments, and crowding out. And again, we ask why for all of these. So habitat disappears because we extract more resources faster than they could be replaced. Why? Because more is always worth more. We also create more living and agricultural space because we have more people with a costlier standard of living. Why? Because more is always worth more. We poison environments because we're constantly attempting better solutions than nature offers. Why? To produce more, faster, and cheaper, because more is always worth more. Environments are also poisoned by burning massive amounts of fossil fuel. Why? Well, to produce cheap and powerful energy, because more is always worth more. The reasons for crowding out, same story. We'll also see it when we ask why resources are over-harvested, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, there are qualitative causes at play as well. I may be cherry picking the answers to my whys, but the idea that more is always worth more shows up everywhere, and you won't find it in sustainable cultures. So note that the core reason are not human ignorance. Some may start out that way, but even when impacts become known, our actions very rarely change. This is because number-based value systems consistently take precedence and trump other qualitative concerns. So let's look at some more. Why did the COVID-19 pandemic hit us so hard? Here are 8 answers why. I don't need to read them out or take you through the why, drill down on all of these. I think most endpoints will already be apparent. We could do the same process for why are we now in a climate emergency, which unquestionably distills down to our more is always worth more value set. So the idea that civilization has lost its way and is setting its focus and goals on the wrong things is nothing new. We all know that GDP is a terrible way of measuring human progress. So what I'm proposing is a generalized way of distinctly identifying the problematic value system that takes us in the wrong directions. That is, measuring success by number, regardless of what you're counting. I'll provide some proof of this in a moment. Note that we are not talking about greed, because greed is defined as an excess. And for there to be a definable excess, there must exist a concept of sufficiency that is being exceeded. Greed is a failing that can easily be treated where the level of sufficiency is known and doesn't exist where sufficiency is undefined. For example, I contend that there is no such thing as corporate greed. To accuse a traditional publicly traded commercial corporation of greed, you would have to have defined levels of sufficiency for whatever you're talking about, whatever you're measuring, assets, revenue, resource extraction, dividends, whatever. Since such corporations are abstract concepts specifically designed and programmed to maximize shareholder value and growth, there's no such thing as a level of sufficiency. The concept doesn't apply. So greed is not the problem that we're trying to solve in that case. I mean, what is sufficient revenue for ExxonMobil? What is sufficient growth for Amazon? The people running them might be greedy, but that is necessarily a separate consideration. Now, this is more than just pedantic wordplay. It's an important attribute of number-based values. So let's look at this in a visual sense. What is this exponential curve? It could be a lot of things that we recognize from the CACOR talks, are riddled with such images. But if its trajectory never changes, it's nothing from nature. It's the plot of a number-based value. And now, this is not easy to grasp, especially for the scientists out there, because we all know that natural growth follows exponential curves, but that's only in isolation, and nothing exists in isolation. So everything in our physical world is interconnected, something many seem to have forgotten. If this graph that I'm showing there were plotting a real insect population, some other factor would intervene and it would eventually stop going up and curve downwards. Nothing in nature is infinite. Remember, only numbers have that property. And more importantly, while feedback loops can be positive or neutral or negative, numeric values almost invariably have positive feedback loops. So let's look at a related characteristic. In the natural world, there is not a huge difference between the average height of the tallest 10% and the shortest 10%, and we can usually take a good guess at what those heights would be. So graphed differently, the numbers follow what is appropriately named a normal distribution curve. The same does not apply to salaries or authors sorted by number of books sold, for example. In these cases, the greatest impacts on any overall average are also the rarest, and they happen at the top. Think of Harry Potter sales. They were off the charts. So Nicholas Nassim Taleb relates this to what he calls black swans. And that concept is quite common with number-based values, again, because of positive feedback loops. One interesting thing about the graph of the ultra-high top 10%, it's often a fractal. And if you were to graph just that top 10%, then the top 1% would usually show this difference again. Like the 8 men who now own the same wealth as half of the 4 billion people who make up the poorest half of the population. So the numbers for the top few are far, way and way beyond what anyone would have predicted by looking at the 90% before them. So let's look at how this effect is created in our present economy on a finite planet. So I oppose the concept of land ownership, and not on moral grounds, but because of the simple math. A fixed asset necessary for life that generates an income that can be used to buy more of the asset will produce exponential growth. That's math. I mean, sure, you can regulate ownership, but when the regulations can be trumped by money, they don't apply to the top end. Now add in land owned by immortal corporations and the concept of inheritance of assets within families, and voila, you have the potential for a select few persons or corporations owning everything. Now, bear in mind, you don't actually have to own it so much as control it. So we've all heard of billionaires Zuckerberg and Musk and Buffett and Bezos, etc. But how many of you are familiar with Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, controlling over $10 trillion in financial assets? That's 50 times more than the richest billionaire. So BlackRock and the related corporations Vanguard and State Street hold an effective controlling interest in just about every major publicly traded company you can think of, and many more that you can't. So those who profit by leveraging ownership alone are called economic rentiers. They include investors and landlords and money lenders and patent and copyright holders and renters of anything. The wealth of successful economic rentiers can easily grow exponentially. You're always limited by what you can do, but you're never limited by what you can own. Again, in a world of fixed assets where money is all powerful, when ownership leads to more money and money leads to more ownership, the rule of economic rentiers is eventually absolute. I mean, true. Okay, revolutionaries can take them out, but only if the revolutionaries can first disavow or overcome the supreme power of money themselves, which after all is only a belief system, but one that paid security forces might believe in. So perhaps the best available and now least known exploration of these principles, complete with practical solution proposals, was made by Henry George in this book, the proliferation of which was second only to the Bible in its day. You might recall Frank de Jong's CACOR talk about Henry George. So these extremes, salaries, book sales, and the 0.1%, are not really the result of poor policy or greed or unfair implementation of the rules. I contend that they are a mathematical inevitability. They are a direct result of the math of number-based value systems. For example, people who start with more money, larger amount of money, can make money faster than those who start with less. Authors who already have a name or an inside advantage will be promoted more, sell more, which gets people talking more, which drives sales, etc. The prolific book on the right was once referred to as the least read bestseller of all time. And I'll bet most of you have a copy, but unlike millions of others, you guys have probably cracked the cover. So these are positive feedback loops. Again, the idea that more is always worth more does not exist in the real world, except as a dangerous human construct. It's entirely a product of numbers and number-based values. I'll say it again, numbers are the only thing in existence that are limitless. And this is important to grasp because success by any other measure won't have this problem. There will be sufficiency or there will be negative feedback loops. And it also highlights how unnatural number-based value systems really are. And that's what gets us into trouble. For example, we consider improving efficiency to be a good thing. It's a sign of progress. But in a value system where more is always worth more, efficiency becomes a positive feedback loop. Consider efficiency in terms of creating a product. When you find a more efficient process, the overwhelming tendency is to produce more in the same time, not the same amount in less time. So you can drop the price, driving up demand. You inspire efficiencies in related products and processes, repeating these effects. And the overall focus in a competitive market becomes price, not quality. Efficiency is a self-amplifying feedback loop. Genuine success is not achieved by making our lives and chores more efficient, any more than heroin makes our lives genuinely happier. We now need a new way of measuring success. I mean, the point has come up in several CACOR talks. Julia Kim's talk on gross national happiness in Bhutan, Ronald Coleman's presentation on the genuine progress indicator, Andrew Gaines' new social paradigm 2 weeks ago. So I can't dictate what the new measure of success should be, but I am dead certain what it isn't, which is measuring success where more is always worth more. How can I be so sure? Well, remember Ruben Nelson's images of two kinds of classrooms? Which one encourages self-discovery? How does the role of the teacher differ in each? You know the answers just by looking at the layouts. And I may not know what the new values are for sustainability, but I know what they have to look like. So the gross national happiness and gross or genuine progress indicator alternatives work to introduce qualitative values onto the scorecard. And they often end up having to try and quantify them, but they're a step in the right direction. Measurement is fine. It's not the numbers themselves that are the problem. However, many qualitative values defy measurement. Let's remind ourselves of what some of these are. They're all very familiar to us because they're hardwired into our psyche. They hold no prominence, though, in our economic systems, and thus minimal real impact on our collective societies. I mean, how do we measure friendship or beauty or culture or justice? Now, it's in this inquiry that I think I make one of my greatest contributions to our field of study. It may be impossible to assign numbers to these concepts, but they can still go up or down, and we still know for ourselves when something is beautiful and when it's not. I propose some very general properties of qualitative values that might allow us to see them graphically in a whole new way. In a very recent Values Committee presentation on conflict, I introduced this concept in a few minutes that I was allotted, so allow me to share it again. Qualitative values still have relative measures. They still go up and down. Freedom may not have a number, but we know when we have more or less of it. So let's start with what we know. For example, how do you increase freedom over time? Well, that depends on what's currently lowering it. If you're struggling under an authoritarian regime that controls every aspect of your life, then freedom is achieved by relaxing such controls and structure. But if you remove all control and structure, you don't get freedom. You get lawless anarchy, where no one is free to pursue their choices and desires because there's no respect for the rights of others. And when one is in violent anarchy, freedom is achieved by adding some order and commonly recognized ground rules. The value that is freedom is thus defined as some sort of dynamic dance between order and chaos. And this cycle is as natural as breathing. Inhaling and exhaling are two mutually exclusive actions, both necessary to life, but there is no point which we can achieve and maintain a perfect balance of gases. To everything, there is a benefit and a cost, constant change, and most importantly, to everything, there is inherent sufficiency. Life is all about dynamic forces that must be in constant transition between mutually exclusive poles, high value to low, to opposite high value to opposite low. This system is actually known as a polarity, and it's also used to map natural cycles, such as the dynamic transitions that make up a forest system sustainably by predictably oscillating between the fast-growing pioneer species diversity and old growth maturity. Nature does not fight forest fires and overcrowding. Nature uses them as negative feedback to transition from one phase to another. So my breakthrough was to recognize many more value examples. You can plot beauty as a polarity of simplicity and complexity, or religion as faith in omniscience versus self-determination. Species survival can be expressed as a polarity, the self-preservation versus the good of the whole. So I'm suggesting that all qualitative values can be expressed as a polarity as a result of the opposition or simultaneous functioning of mutually exclusive impulses or ideas. Think about the graphs that we usually work with. We can easily graph past fossil fuel usage versus renewables, and even graph proposed limits on future resource usage. This model, on the other hand, shows you the actual motivations for the change and the roadmaps for how we achieve those actions. It actually encapsulates a lot, such as humankind's greatest challenges are polarities. There is no one right answer. We have to embrace conflicts and paradoxes. Secondly, unilateral thinking and unidirectional strategies are doomed to fail. Sufficiency and negative feedback loops must prevail. We have to respect opposing views because we're likely to have to adopt them eventually. And at times, we have to suffer the downside of one approach before we can enjoy the upside of the other. These attributes of a successful existence are not new. They've been introduced by different names in lots of CACOR talks, but by mapping them onto a polarity loop, we'll now be able to apply known polarity management tools and strategies to qualitative value challenges. So this loop is the basis for what I call qualitative economics. So this brings me to the end of part one. You now know some of my tools and perspectives. Let's try to apply them to our reality. So here we are in our modern techno-industrial society, and I have a strong suspicion that most of that technology and industry is a direct result of our core value systems. Finding efficiencies is one thing, but if more is always worth more, then you never accept the status quo. You can always do better. There will be an urge to control nature. No external cost will be too great. You will put natural balances at risk, and tools will be used to permanently alter your surroundings, ignoring any potential consequences 7 generations away. And the payoff in the progress and technology and wealth will accelerate. The human urge to explore was, and still is, almost always in the service of profit-seeking or superiority over others. Some may see this as a positive benefit of number-based value systems, and it certainly can be. Necessity is the mother of invention, and so you get a lot more inventions when profit or vanquishing your neighbors is treated as necessity. The problem arises when that is the only scale used to measure success. As the curve goes vertical, rapid obsolescence of the technologies and the consequent abuse of resources becomes a given. So allowing number-based values to consistently overrule innate human values is not an inherent flaw. I mean, it may in fact be an inevitable stage of evolution. You might recall Mike Nickerson's CACOR talk using the analogy of the butterfly having to pass through the caterpillar phase. Nor have we fully abandoned our qualitative values, and it would be impossible to ever do so. They are what makes us human. But we allow them to be overruled and suppressed by purely quantitative measures at every turn. And this difficulty of pitting immediate quantitative payoffs against longer-term consequences might actually go quite far back in our ancestry. So we all know how smart monkeys can be. So imagine them in an agricultural setting. Farmers in some countries have long had to contend with primates coming in and stealing crops or breaking things and making them a very unwelcome species. So how do you capture a monkey? Well, the solution is surprisingly simple. Hunters would find some fixed container, such as an anchored gourd or even a termite mound, and a hole would be made in the container just big enough for the monkey to push their hand through. And then some favorite foods, such as nuts or fruits, are placed inside. And that's all it takes. They now have a monkey trap. So when a hungry primate comes along, it reaches in to take the food out, and the opening might be a little tad tight at first, but our clever friend is persistent. And once they have their hand inside, they snatch up the treats in their fist, and success. But now there's a problem. They can't pull their hand out again, stuffed as it is with the food. Now you might think that they would realize their plight and decide that the food's not worth being trapped, and they drop it, and so they can pull their hand out. But they don't. They're hungry. And what they're craving for is actually in their hand. They're not willing to let it go, even if it means escape and return to their freedom. In our case, we could easily know what we have to do to get free from our monkey traps and what will probably happen if we don't let go of our modern techno-industrial obsession with financial wealth. But we don't. We can't. And thus, we tie ourselves to that fate. There are alternatives. I mean, there always have been. We've heard snippets in CACOR talks about Eastern value systems. The diagram at bottom right is a recent regenerative economics mandala from John Fullerton, quite interesting. Many past speakers, including Larry McDermott and Lalith Gunaratne, Ramola Thumbadu, and Alan Betts, have repeatedly reminded us that indigenous populations lived for tens of thousands of years without running up against the unsustainable doom of basing their values on numbers. In another talk, Ruben Nelson shared a historical definition note that indigenous people were called uncivilized because they didn't live in cities. It's not that indigenous peoples weren't smart enough to develop technology, nor do I believe that it was pure accident that Europe went in the direction that it did. I think it's based on choices made, which connects back to value systems. Okay, so here's the question. How might indigenous humans have possibly been aware of the problem with success by number thousands of years ago, before there was even money? Well, perhaps 7th-generation thinking can inherently sense and avoid these outcomes. I suggest that the fact that numeric values and numeric value thinking contrasts so much with the natural world, that might be the factor. When whole societies distance themselves from nature and begin exclusively adopting that measurement of success as more, the obviousness of the flaw in the value system is lost. Again, the difference can start out small, very subtle. Agriculture, the same game changer that allows occupational specialization and communities to collaborate on common purpose. Well, that also allows slavery and significant hierarchies, which leads to accumulation, and wealth, and power by number. Big agriculture was fundamental to human progress, but such progress has unnatural properties. Modern techno-industrial civilization is itself a positive feedback loop. Now, again, it's not that the quantitative urge is wrong. It's not possible to live by qualitative values alone. Beauty and justice are great, but no matter how delicious or justly acquired your food might be, we still need more than the sufficient quantity to live, and it's desirable to have a little bit more than the bare minimum. As Bill Rees points out, humans, and indeed all species, are programmed to be unsustainable by nature. We are all hardwired for growth and consumption and procreation and filling up all the available space. Consider even the indigenous peoples who wastefully drove herds of bison over cliffs, or who cut down the last tree on Easter Island. This urge is managed in the interconnected natural world by negative feedback. We need negative feedback. But humans are smart. We rose to the top of the pyramid by defeating nature's normal negative feedback mechanisms. And any future mechanism would therefore have to be powerful and persistent and lethal. And it would seem that nature has decided the best species to create such a mechanism would be ourselves. And it's what Bill Rees calls ecological overshoot. The deadliest negative feedback is a positive feedback loop on a finite planet. So remember that I said no exponential curve could exist in nature, and yet we see them all around us now? Well, I still stand by my reasoning. So perhaps we are simply not seeing the whole picture. Yes, if we could actually get our act together, we could try bending the initial curve down, but we'd simply be adding a very small delay to the inevitable. This is not a case of flattening the curve in order to buy time to develop vaccines. Not in this case. So long as we are on a finite planet beset with multiple complex challenges to our biosphere and measuring success with an infinite ruler, the other shoe will drop. It has to. So what is the solution? What do we have to do? I have an answer to this, which might surprise you. But first, let's look at some earlier vexing questions in order to illustrate how I arrived at my own conclusion. I can't predict the future, but after 150 CACOR talks and discussions, I can anticipate some of your questions, and who knows, some of them may already be out there in the chat. Indeed, almost 3 decades ago, Buzz Nixon, a past CACOR chair, posed 33 profound questions at the 5,000 days meeting in Guelph, most of which began with why. And sure enough, although a few have now been resolved in the intervening 30 years, the rest come up again and again. I'm going to arrogantly attempt to come up with an answer, some plausible answers in the short time that we have remaining, or that at least I have for this talk. Have a look at question number 1. I'll paraphrase. Why has humankind managed to create a predicament which is almost precisely what we don't want? Well, so far, much of my talk has addressed the core of that very question. I suggest we were working with a flawed measurement of success. Question number 2 is more prevalent. Paraphrasing again, why, with all we know about our predicament and have known for so long, has there been so little action taken? Society's inaction is a relative phenomenon. Some people do nothing, perhaps for good reasons. Some people do a lot, but it's still not enough. There is a spectrum, and every one of us has a place on it. There are some barriers to grasping and responding to the challenge. So here are some of them. Timelines or chains of effect are too long. We don't intuitively connect the dots. There's often a geographical disconnect between where the cause is and where the effect is felt. Ignorance in or inaccessible communication to the general population. We are wired for stories and anecdotes and data. Wired for stories and anecdotes, not data. For months, Syrian refugees were crowding into camps, and they were just another number. If you remember, it wasn't until the image of a drowned 3-year-old boy washed up on a beach went viral that attitudes in North America suddenly changed. We don't respond to numbers. We respond to relationships. We all know what NIMBYs are. Well, NIMPLs say, not in my perceived life expectancy. They believe that the collapse is not going to affect them. Number-based value success is partly achieved by creating a positive feedback loop through the actual reprogramming of our brains. And more on that in a moment. There's also intentional attempts to deflect and distort the truth by persons or entities who profit from the status quo. Hopelessness or apathy, perhaps wisely so, and this too will make sense in a moment. Some people stop at half measures. Though the attitude and the values are right, they're not appreciating the scope of what is needed. And I'm guessing you're familiar with most of these barriers to action. However, working from my answer to question 1, there is another critical obstacle, which I call the value change conundrum. You won't change your value system until you see the benefits of the new value system, which you will only truly see when using the new value system. I mean, cost-benefit analysis is difficult to apply to value system changes when perhaps the costs under one system are actually the benefits in the other. Interestingly enough, Buzz Nixon echoed this precise conundrum as a catch-22 syndrome in question 30 of his 33. So here's a popular quote in our circles. I think it even came up in the introduction. No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. I have my own version. No value crisis can be solved from the same value system that created it. You've got to change the value system. Questions 7 and 8 are particularly relevant to this talk. The numbers merit their own focused exploration, although we have touched on some of this today. It's worth noting a quote from one of Bill Reese's CACOR talks. It's this one. Bruce Wexler suggests that those attitudes, values, and behaviors that Buzz was asking about become physically encoded in the brain, and attempts to change them can cause cognitive dissonance and thus inaction. This tells us a lot about which generation we should be talking to. As for what has to be changed, the scale is massive and all-encompassing. It's what David Korten calls a deep change from the scale of a new civilization. New economic models, renewed understanding of our place and purpose within our ecosystem, new values. Clive Spash says the same thing. The essence of our relationship to the planet and each other has to change. But good news, it is a relationship that our ancestors would recognize. It could add thousands of years to human existence. Questions 28 and 29 of Buzz's list are lengthy, but they basically come down to this. We at CACOR, and in fact the Club of Rome itself, have been studying this for decades. Why are our own actions not more effective? Well, consider the list of disasters facing us simultaneously in extreme complexity. And now add in the challenges introduced by the predominance of number-based values like corporations and exponential curves and black swans, etc. And now look at the talks that we ourselves are having. Are we going to meet at the UN or elsewhere and talk our way out of this? Are we going to legislate our way out of this? Are we going to nuclear or solar power or microgrid our way out? Are we going to green invest our way out? Are we going to make small to medium lifestyle sacrifices in order to get out of this? Should we be monetizing nature's benefits to get it on corporate balance sheets, thereby bending nature's values to match ours? No, 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 and no. John Verdon was right when he said, climate change is not a technological or political problem as much as a crisis of consciousness. This is not to say that such discussions and explorations that we have are not valuable. Some are very valuable indeed. However, I boldly suggest that they should be aimed at a different goal. And this brings us to the most intractable question of all, one that refers back to my value change conundrum. We hear these after every CACOR talk. How do we make it happen? When will we have critical mass? Who will do this? So CACOR presentations typically talk about the who in two realms: visionary leadership blazing the trail to a new world, or grassroots movements leading the revolution to harmony with nature. Just 2 weeks ago, Andrew Gaines envisioned a league of evolutionary catalysts. My take is simply this: we will not be led out of this crisis ahead of time. Why not? Governments have insufficient power to enact this scale of change. Bill Reese is right. What is politically feasible is ecologically irrelevant, and what is ecologically necessary is politically unfeasible. Political office and policies are all up for sale to multinationals and uber wealthy ideologues, because so long as the monetary value systems can trump all others, the people with the most money will rule absolutely. There's a lot of rich nimples out there. The genuine progress indicator is a wonderful scorecard, but we're a long way from anyone actually getting elected using those numbers. It's sad but true. And what has to be done would take a lot longer than any one term of office. So it's not that there's a total absence of political leadership, it's just that they would never last. And how do we know all this? Well, we're into COP26, and that's just looking at one of the impending planetary scale threats to civilization. Okay, option 2, can the people enact collective change from the bottom? Well, I think it highly improbable, based on what we've already looked at in this talk. The value change conundrum, the wiring of our brains, the level of organization and focus required, the power of the opposing forces, the time and re-education needed. I don't believe the required changes are going to be undertaken by the general public soon enough to avert disaster. I side with a third option: nature herself being the instigator of the change. Our inaction will be her negative feedback. If we're looking for a Pearl Harbor moment, this is 100% guaranteed to happen. Now, please understand that I am not a doomsayer. Indeed, I believe this to be a great source of optimism and hope. The answer to the value change conundrum is that you can change your value system when your current value system has already failed you. In other words, we need a cataclysmic external shock. I think that Bill's on the right path here in what he's saying, but to cast us as a world of sleepwalkers participating in a culture-wide conspiracy of denial is, I think, a little unfair. There are more forgivable reasons why we are where we are today. We may need a staggering ecological disaster, but that shouldn't be seen as a punishment for some long-standing civilizational error. And would a disaster actually help? I believe so. I mean, think about it. The global COVID-19 pandemic devastated lives and businesses, and it turned our world upside down. And I have no intention of disrespecting the memory of the millions of people that we lost. On the other hand, our perspective on the human species and economics and politics and what's important, have those changed in the right direction, at least temporarily as a result? Did leadership the world over sit up and take notice? Did economic activity actually pause big time? Did we take actions on an effective, meaningful solution? You bet we did. Remember our list of massive, simultaneous, complex disasters rapidly approaching tipping points? The world now talks mainly about climate change as being the single biggest imminent threat, because they're starting to see it as already well underway in their backyard. But is that a problem we want to solve? Imagine if we could solve climate change in 1 year using technology. What then? What about resource scarcity, uncontrolled technologies like AI run amok, the global poisoning, overpopulation, et cetera, et cetera? We could still have all of the other global threats, but in terms of awareness and policies and moving forward, we would be back to square one, or worse, if those threats had longer timelines or effects that were less gradual. Solving one threat is not good enough and may, in fact, be impossible without addressing the others. Indeed, solving climate change might be catastrophic for solving the value crisis. If our objective is to transition to a new form of civilization and an externally imposed disaster is what is needed, doesn't that suggest that climate change could actually be a part of the solution? Okay, so this is a radical thought, so hear me out. Will a climate emergency signal the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it? Well, yes, and that is actually our objective. Will much of our modern techno-industrial society infrastructure be destroyed beyond repair? Probably. Will there be chaos and anarchy and deadly conflict as fights erupt over dwindling resources? Without question. Will there be suffering and a tragic death rate? Well, I fear so. Is there an alternative? I'm not convinced of one. Perhaps the outcome that I describe is unthinkable. But what does that mean? Does that mean we can't or won't think of it? I should be frank and say that this particular conclusion only came to me very, very recently as I was preparing this talk, and merits much deeper inquiry. So for now, I'm just going to leave it out there. Whether it's correct or not, I'm not suggesting that we give up. I'm suggesting we reframe the problem and our actions to better suit the reality that's becoming increasingly self-evident. If we're going to survive and thrive, we have work to do. We've already had lots of CACOR talks proposing candidates for the mega disaster that will pull the rug out from under our current house of cards and knock over the first domino. So in terms of the best preparation strategy, if I'm right about the value crisis common to all of them, it doesn't really make a big difference which disaster it is. So how difficult would it be for us to focus on solving the value crisis instead of the several symptomatic disasters that result from it? Well, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that our brains are constantly being rewired to prefer overrides by quantitative values. For many, it may be too late. The good news is our brains are already wired for qualitative values, and those human values are embedded in our programming. We just need a better balance. There's more good news. So much of the old MTI civilization model is what Yuval Noah Harari calls myth. Corporations, financial wealth, these exist on paper or in databases. They can be changed simply by telling a different story. Of course, that won't be easy while they still hold the power. On the plus side, there are lots of better ways of doing things, surviving and thriving, ways that support both sustainability and human joy. And one reason we struggle to implement them now is that these changes tend to score poorly by status quo measures of success, casting them as sacrifices, not improvements. Furthermore, those things don't usually scale up within the old system, so they can be implemented individually, but you can't implement them collectively without a collective value change. Still, regardless of the direction society goes, those changes can be implemented for ourselves right now by choice, and many will give us more joy than before. So here is a proposal for a new overarching objective. Instead of attempting to solve all disasters, which is not going to happen, why not devote ourselves to instilling a better value balance in the next generation? Now think about that for a second. We have to increase awareness of both the impossibility of basing society on number-based value systems and increasing the awareness of the alternative systems. We have to focus those efforts on the next generation before they learn to dismiss their qualitative values. They have to know that more is not always worth more. And why would we adopt that goal? Well, let's review our obstacles to effective actions. Our timelines now overlap with the effects, so there would be no one would have to be convinced of the problem anymore. We would address the ignorance with more effective education to a motivated audience using stories and teaching that fits the need. There are no nimples in the next generation. The change is definitely within their perceived life expectancy. And by de-escalating the insidious precedence of number-based values, we reduce the ability for that culture to rewire people's brains. This also provides a defense against those who intentionally fight against the changes to protect their profitable status quo. And by no longer attempting to fix or stop the inevitable, which might be impossible, we actually provide hope for the future. And half measures are still valuable, since the goal is to change our values precedents, not nature itself and the things around us. How to achieve this goal would be a separate talk, and one that I hope CACOR might invite me to give. Meanwhile, here are some highlights. We continue working on solutions that fit non-numeric values, and this would include the energy solutions and the climate change adaptation and mitigation, all of those great talks. We focus our energy on the next generations. We genuinely demonstrate and live those non-numeric values. We experience and share the joy of the qualitative values. We teach the principles of circular economies. I believe we need qualitative economies where value is based on relationships and quality, not quantity and price. Communities, economies, and governance will all have to be localized, yada, yada, yada. You've heard all of this before. And my most specific implementation for right now, just to give you something concrete, help sever the connection between modern slavery, in other words, jobs, which we need in order to survive, and survival by supporting a guaranteed basic income, which will give an altered value perspective to everyone, not just the poor. And I think it would help civilization evolve to the next stage. So, as I say, our time today is limited, and I would love to share more stories. My most recent book talks about some of the proven direct applications, proven from history, applications of qualitative thinking in our eco-civilization. And here are some of the things that I believe we need to talk about later. Until then, I've thrown a lot at you today, so let's open up the chat for some discussion and questions. Mike, over to you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. That was stimulating. I was particularly intrigued by the notion of being able to see the new paradigm only from within it. So we have a bit of a bootstrap operation to pick ourselves up and be able to then look at the whole system from that other way of looking at it. Because as long as we see the economic math, then we need to make more. So that's a challenge right there. I have a question, and Dave Doherty is on deck, so we could go there. My question has to do, you're familiar with the more fun, less stuff notion. Yes. How do you see that fitting into your polarity framework?
Well, I can definitely envision a polarity with stuff on one pole and fun without stuff on the other pole. It's essentially the conflict between quantitative and qualitative values. Actually, a really neat way of visualizing this came to me when I was trying to explain the concept of gifts to someone. Maybe I can share my screen again, and I can find that slide. Let me just pop over to there, and if I can find it. I should be able to find it pretty quickly, because I know it was coming up soon. Oh, I just go back to PowerPoint. There it is. So look carefully at the image on the left. A physical gift is represented by the white chalice, and the act of giving is represented by the two black faces in profile. And this is the relationship created by the gift. And when we're more focused on the object itself, the stuff, like the detail shown in the right image, we have a lot more trouble seeing the relationship. It's harder to see the faces on the other side. And that would explain why most people kind of roll their eyes when they say, oh, gift economy, geez, everyone's going to be giving stuff away. Yeah, that's going to work. Because they're so focused on the objects and the prices that they don't see the relationship values. And the thing that I learned from that image is, interestingly, that qualitative and quantitative values and economies can actually exist simultaneously, even within the same transaction. Remember when John Verdon was talking about the ground and field switching places? This is what that looks like. This is what he was talking about, and it's the basis of what I call the qualitative economy. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. David, you've got a question, and Art Hunter is on deck.
Hi. I need to go back and find it. Here we go. So I was wondering if I'm correct in concluding this. Have you just blown, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, out of the water?
No, I don't think so. But there is, it's just different ways of measuring it. In other words, if we can even measure some things by number that are qualitative values. We can measure the amount of red, how red something is by a number. The difference is not whether you can measure it or not, but whether that measurement is defining the success. So if you say we need something more red, then you can see by measurement whether it is more red. But if you define success as being the most red that it could possibly be, well, if that's a limitless thing, then you run into more is always worth more, and you have no sense of sufficiency. So it's not the measurement, it's the definition of success, of using that measure as the measure of success. Because if it's a number, more will always be worth more. That's just the definition of how measuring by number works. Measuring success by number works. You see the difference?
Yeah, I'm having trouble with it.
Okay.
Also,
Okay.
I spent a lot of my career managing hazardous materials and dealing with pollution.
Yeah.
And for the most part, more was always bad.
It's okay. Well,
just an observation.
Sure. So the idea then, if we were somehow to reverse that, that if we said more of dryness is always worth more. So if we're trying to solve a flood, we want to reduce the amount of water, but there is a level of sufficiency to reducing the amount of water. So if we adopted that as our measurement of success, that more dryness is always more successful, we would end up in drought. So remember that diagram of the loop. I can actually draw it up here. In your particular case, on one side, you have some substance that you think is bad and you don't want to have too much of it. But if you were to completely eliminate it, maybe that substance is necessary for some manufacturing somewhere. So you need a small amount, you just don't want too much. So there's sufficiency, right? Even in hazardous wastes, there's probably a measure that certain number of parts per million is okay.
Well, certainly we manage as if that were the case. And we keep getting surprised by situations where it turns out not to be the case.
Right, right. Because
a good example would be lead.
Yeah.
In the blood, it turns out that there's a kind of sweet spot where there seem to be very few effects. And if we get lower than that amount, you'd think we shouldn't have a problem. It turns out at those lower amounts, that's where babies get brain damage.
Yeah. So we discover these things because we're introducing the lead in a way that is not known to our natural systems that have evolved for thousands of years. If, on the other hand, we were talking about, say, oxygen, you would say, well, oxygen's always good. We always love oxygen. Wouldn't it be neat to be in an environment of pure oxygen? Well, we would die in an environment of pure oxygen because more is not always worth more. I'll give you another example. We don't like bacteria that make us sick. But if we were to be able to raise a baby in an environment where there were no bacteria that could make it sick, as soon as it encountered that, it would die because it would have no defense mechanisms. We have to walk on a broken leg. That's why they give you a cast, because if we were to break our legs and put ourselves in bed until it heals, it would never heal. There is always a certain level of things in the natural world that we have to be exposed to in order to develop the appropriate capabilities for handling it. It just so happened that lead is not one of the things that occurs in the natural world in a way that gets into our bloodstream at the level that harms newborns' brains. And we only discovered that when we were using lead for other things, trying to make ourselves more efficient in our combustible engines, because more is always worth more.
Yeah, I call this the cult of efficiency. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you. That's perfect.
Okay, Art, your question to be followed by Ted Manning.
Okay, this idea and the concept you put forward, of course, have appeared before in some of the presentations in our webinars here. and of course, survive and thrive, and the whole concept that says we are headed to some form of disaster. There's no way around it, and I call that you know, a population correction, because clearly all the fixes, technical fixes and everything cannot be applied to 8 billion or 10 billion people, you know, but it might well work when you have a much smaller population of, say, 1 billion or even 100 million. Now, on the 5th, if I could just
sorry, go ahead.
On the 5th of October, we've got Jack Alpine coming back. And of course, this is what he tries to address, that says, what is this minimum population? Because we're heading to it. And of course, the issue is, how can we moderate the correction which is coming, such that it really is not an extinction, and hence we really have to, as you've said, prepare the next generation's value balance, and demonstrate to them some of the ways that they can survive, because they need all the help they can get, particularly from our generation, who is clearly responsible for a lot of the problems which are coming. So I function in a world, of course, where I try, using numbers, to actually improve my energy savings, which is I'm guilty. I use number-based value system, and but I'm saying that more tongue-in-cheek, but you know, the point is that being able to demonstrate that there is a way that you can function outside of the fossil fuel industry as best you can, and not only that, to demonstrate it and live it. I try to do that, of course, by living in a fossil fuel free microgrid. And
exactly, you're demonstrating those values.
And demonstrating it, not just talking about it, actually doing it. Now, I would actually turn it around on you. Are there other ways that we should be planning to survive, things that we should be able to pass on to subsequent generations that would help reduce, you know, the falling off a cliff implies that there's jagged rocks below, and nobody's going to survive. Is there some way that we can cushion that and make the fall not as deep, and a softer landing, as well as stretching it out over a longer period of time?
Right. So I'm going to actually first address the little elephant that you introduced right at the beginning, because I knew it would come up, and that's the thought of the population idea. And I think that it's important to realize that if you applied that YY tree to the population and asked yourself why we have overpopulation, I can think of maybe 6 reasons why. It's positive feedback. We have more people, more babies, and more people, and that's a natural law. We have fewer people dying because of food technology and disease control. We have longer lifespans due to health and medical technology. We have uneducated and unempowered women due to sometimes dominance issues and household efficiency and the wealth of children and how people measure that. And the economy needs people for consumerism. And as we've already discussed, humans have postponed the negative feedback that nature normally uses to control populations. And I think that if we look at those things, we'll notice how often that more is always worth more value set creeps into the causes of overpopulation. And I think once we adjust the value system, the population starts to take care of itself. The question you had second then was, is there a way we can avoid dropping off the cliff? Not officially, because the way a polarity works is if you want to get over from A to B, and actually we're not in A, we're now experiencing the downside of A over here in C. The only way you can get to B is by going through that downside of A. The value change conundrum does apply. It has to be addressed. You cannot see the value of earning less money and having fewer things and living in smaller spaces until the more is always worth more doesn't apply, and it isn't being applied all around you, and it isn't being shoved down your throat. So you do have to experience some of the downside in order to say, we have to change something. We have to head over to the other side. I don't know how much downside you have to experience, but I do know that there are certain things out there right now that might just tip the scales. I mean, if we end up with one group of people holding all of the money and owning all of the property effectively, it's pretty easy for us to decide, okay, well, then we don't believe in money anymore. Suddenly that power is gone. We'd have chaos, we'd have anarchy, we'd have to develop new economies and new value systems, but we could do it. And we could do it maybe before nature takes out a lot of what we truly value in terms of the nature around us. But no, I think we have to go through there before we hit the other side. Ugly truth.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Ted, you're next. Peter Belkowski is on deck.
Andrew, I very much enjoyed this. Boy, do you have our number. As you undoubtedly have seen on a number of the presentations, several of the folks in CACOR and the Club of Rome have come to the same realization that you do, which is we have fixated on a few metrics, and we've allowed essentially the economists to rule the world, even though we don't elect them. This brings me to a comment on this, which is many of us have come to the conclusion that we have to redefine the metrics almost completely. And there's an initiative focusing on well-being that several of us with the Club of Rome and a couple of people invited directly from CACOR have been working on for about 1.5 years now. In fact, we hope to have a product to come out. And the notion is to redefine well-being in a way that isn't just who has the term that we used first was Gorton's, you can't eat money. The notion, that's what really set us off in the first place. We said, if that's true, what's the alternative? And we're on the path of trying to come up with an alternative that looks at, may change people's decision processes. Now, are we going to do it in time? I wish I could be sanguine about this, but we found even when we were trying to do such simple things as protect farmland from being paved over, that it had to get so bad that it actually got people's attention. And even you had to have a bad year. And when we then fooled them that they were going to starve if they didn't fix it, even though it was wrong, it was worth lying to them to get them on side. So they actually would pass the legislation to allow us to protect a lot of Canada's best farmland. Yeah, you got to get their attention. And so what I want to ask you then is, yeah, I'm not going to bother about the number thing, but the thing is, can we in fact define enough in any terms of the things that might cause people to limit their acquisitions of whatever they are, from power to experiences to goods?
Yeah, I think we can. And I think because we're wired that way to understand enough. That's deep within our programming and the nature around us, and we did it for thousands of years. I actually referred to this in the talk, so I'll dig back to it. Developing a way of measuring well-being and using that as your measure of value is perfect. That's excellent. Don't try and convince the governments to use it. The difference then is where you direct that knowledge and where you direct that wisdom. You direct it at the people who are coming up from the bottom, the next generation, and show them that well-being is actually defined as not having the next latest game system or the latest phone, but having fun with your friends and experiencing some of the joy that comes from, dare I say it, less stuff and more fun. So define the well-being, but don't try and convince the people who are based on something else that that's the way to go. Really
several governments, Andrew, several governments are now buying in, at least.
That's right, they are.
Concept.
They are, and in fact,
Yeah.
The best way of identifying a government that's buying into that is whether they're run by a woman or not. But think back.
Vancouver isn't, but that's another question.
Yeah, no, sure. Think back to an interesting thing is, why do we have governments? Why were they ever put in place in the first place? And to my way of thinking, if you dig back, one of the major factors in government is that it was our way of imposing negative feedback on some of the number-based value systems that ran away on ourselves. We discovered that we had to actually put in rules and regulations. Otherwise, some of the people that were based entirely on more and more and more and more were starting to act irresponsibly. The problem is governments don't do that anymore. Now governments have fully adopted or some governments have fully adopted the more is always worth more. And they cannot get out of that value system. We have governments that say we have to recycle more and we have to use less paper. And so they're going to put all these systems into place. But as soon as you threaten jobs, whoa, okay, we can't shut down that paper mill because we have to find new jobs for these people. So basing it on well-being is all very well until you hit that one factor, jobs. Oh my God, we have to keep these people in jobs. Why? Because jobs drive the economy. Why? Because the economy needs to create jobs. And one of the really interesting ways of getting yourself out of that cycle is the guaranteed basic income. Because suddenly people who are going off to studies and learning philosophy or learning arts or culture, this sort of thing, they don't have to suddenly get a job as soon as they're out of university. They can explore those options because there is an alternative to money equaling survival. And so when I was looking at the solutions to all of this, the one I stumbled on as the first and biggest game changer step was actually a guaranteed basic income. You want a well-being economy? Institute a guaranteed basic income, and people are actually talking about it. And it's actually being talked about by multiple parties, across parties. PEI unanimously said, we want a guaranteed basic income. Conservatives, liberals, Green Party, they're all on board. So I think that's the most exciting way to maybe slip a well-being measure in the side door.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, John Meyer, you're on deck.
Hi, Peter Bulkowski, an oil and gas, oil sands chemist. So that's my background, Andrew. In terms of your view of sustainability and of your new value sets, do you include population of what is now about 8 billion and still going up? How do you incorporate that as values? We've got the 8 billion, and
Yep.
I see very few people who are willing to commit suicide or murder their children at 30 years of age to reduce that population.
Yep. So that's where the number-based or the nature feedback is going to hit. I think that if we can establish that we could actually pull this off with 8 billion people on this planet, and some people say we can do that, and so I don't dispute that. That's not my area of expertise. So if we could do that and do it under a different value system, that would be great. I think that I'm not advocating murder or suicide, but I do recognize that nature doesn't really care whether we exist or not. And if she comes along and says, right, I'm going to take out a few million people by floods or forest fires or pandemics or what have you, that will happen. I think that I sometimes, I remember I used to talk to church groups and I said, what was more important, saving one life or saving 1,000? And they said, well, I guess saving 1,000. Well, no, that's just a number, because what if the one life was your child? Oh, well, that's a little different. We measure things not in terms of number, we measure them in terms of the qualitative relationships that we have. Again, it goes back to that Syrian boy who washed up on the beach. So to say that 8 billion is worth more than 4 billion is a mistake. And it's interesting, somebody in a previous talk, I can't remember who it was, but they were actually talking about how we had to reduce the population. And at the same time, they were saying all of these solutions that would actually save lives. What? It doesn't work.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. So as I say, maybe the finite planet could support 8 billion. I know that we consider a lot of the things that are happening in countries where the fertility rate is going down as being good things. So maybe we can last long enough to just let it naturally curve down. But so long as we have an economy that is demanding more people in order to be consumers, in order to create more jobs, in order to keep the economy going, that's going to get us into trouble.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, John, you're on, and Dave had another question, Dave Doherty.
Yeah, when the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor, they were good enough to put Japanese logos on the sides of their planes. And then half an hour, 45 minutes later, they actually declared war on the US. So the US then declared war on Japan and attacked the problem. So that's a Pearl Harbor moment.
Yep.
9/11, a bunch of people attacked the US, and the US and us, the West, we attacked Iraq and Afghanistan, countries which had no part really in the attacks, the government at least. I think according to the book I read by George Bush's, was it the National Security Advisor? I can't come up with his name. He said that George Bush told him to pin it on Iraq. And the US did in fact attack Iraq, as opposed to Saudi Arabia, where 18, I think, of the 20 attackers came from. So I don't think anyone can supply the answer here, but how are we going to make sure that when real trouble arrives, is it going to be a Pearl Harbor moment, or is it going to be a 9/11 moment where we actually pin the blame on the right source and apply our energy to dealing with the real issue?
Right. I think that one of the clues there might be the value system change. When before Pearl Harbor happened, the United States had a value system which said, we are going to stay out of this conflict. We're going to supply goods and have a great profitable turnaround on getting manufacturing going, but we're going to stay out of this. That only works when the value system is working for you. As soon as that value system stops working for you, in other words, there's a direct attack on Pearl Harbor, that's when you consider changing your value system. I think that in the particular case of 9/11, the value system was not so much a value system that changed. I think that the value system that we will continue to try and dominate the places on the earth that had the resources we wanted was still in place, and 9/11 gave them more of an excuse to actually move into a country where they thought they could improve their lot in a number of other ways. So in terms of recognizing who the enemy is, one of the things that I kind of try and do through this talk is to try and say, well, what's a good value and what's a bad value? Actually, no, let me not call them bad values, because there's a balance. We do need both systems. But in terms of when we're trying to shift the pendulum from quantitative over to qualitative values, it's actually pretty easy to recognize what is a quantitative value. Is it such that more is always worth more? Is there a level of sufficiency? And if there isn't, that's a value we want to question. So that's our kind of way of recognizing the difference. I think just because it came up, I think that actually, in many respects, world terrorism and this pushback is another mathematical inevitability almost. You're really talking, those are the cracks in the system where you're seeing areas of the world that are severely impacted by our value system, and they're fighting back in the only way that they can. And these are, we're going to see this more and more as more people become the down in the lower quadrant of income and of ownership. I mean, it has to happen. Land ownership is going to go more and more to the people that already own it. Bill Gates Foundation is buying up farmland all across the United States. Sooner or later, people are going to say, wait, no. And they're not going to be able to fight it legally under the way we currently define ownership. So they're going to do something else.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. Thanks very much.
Okay, Dave, and unless somebody else has got another question, this would be the last question.
Great. So Andrew, as I have you actually reached the conclusion that employment is a modern form of slavery?
Oh, I think so, yes. And I think that humans are entirely capable. As a matter of fact, we want to be productive. We want to do things. We want to keep ourselves occupied. And there's more than enough to be done, more than enough. The problem is that if you say that unless you're working, and unless you're working in the way we dictate, you will starve, then that's slavery. I mean, how else could you define it? Work for us or die. That's slavery. And so a guaranteed basic income is not just for the poor, it's for the people in an abusive relationship, people who want to take a year off, people who want to learn intentional simplicity or what have you. Knowing that you're not going to starve is huge. It's huge. Knowing that you could live at the bare minimum, but that you don't have to think about how much money do I actually need in my bank account in order to survive my senior years is a massive game changer in terms of the values that you consider important. So employment as we have currently defined it, it actually borders on some kind of slavery. And as I say, people want to be productive. Nobody's going to sit on their ass when there's a guaranteed basic income. They want to do things. They want to contribute to society. They just don't want to be having a sword over their head held by a single human hair. That's not a value system that anyone appreciates.
Yeah, I think that the Mincome experiment at Dauphin, Manitoba back in the 70s proved that. Thank you very much.
And as a matter of fact, I'll just throw this in. There was another experiment in Stockton, California, where people were offered $250 a month. Now that's nothing. You can't do much with $250 a month, but the mere gesture of giving them an amount just because they were alive was a game changer for them. They thought, my God, I have worth. People actually think that I count for something. I'm going to spend that $250 on the suit I need to go to job interviews and get a job. And for $250 a month, employment went up, the crime rate went down, all kinds of things, simply because that gift was made. It's a value system change. It's not a numeric change. It's not people being able to suddenly afford food that they couldn't before necessarily. It's a value change. And that's really neat.
Very good. Fascinating, Andrew. Thank you. And we'll turn it over to Jean to thank you formally. Mute, unmute.
Okay, there we go. Andrew, I usually say this, and this time I just think you gave an absolutely fantastic presentation. It is my privilege to get the opportunity to thank most of the speakers. And again, today, this has been wonderful. You've very thought-provoking. And I think you've left a lot of people shaking their heads and trying to think, how can we make this work? So again, on behalf of CACOR, I would really like to thank you for the presentation that you gave us today.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
For those of you who are not a member of CACOR and have not been to too many of our presentations before, I would strongly encourage you to go to our website, canadiancore.com, and sign up for this.
Lost your voice.
I think we may have lost her entirely.